So usually, when you hear a story about someone just disappearing, there's like a clear expectation of how that plays out.
Right, like a frantic search or a completely clean break.
Exactly. Someone packs a bag in the middle of the night, uh, hops on a train, and just vanishes into the unknown, leaving their old life entirely behind.
Oh,
But if you step into the historical and literary landscape of late antiquity, well, that vanishing act gets flipped entirely on its head.
oh, absolutely. It's a completely different paradigm.
Yeah, so imagine a story where the ultimate disappearance does not involve running away to the edge of the map,
Mm.
but rather hiding in plain sight. In the most, agonizing, psychologically taxing way imaginable.
Yeah, the profound endurance it would take to pull that off isn't just a physical vanishing act. It really requires complete dissolution of the ego.
Right.
You aren't just leaving your zip code, you know? You are actively erasing who you are while standing right next to the people who love you.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive into these sources. We are pulling from a wildly diverse stack of materials today, ranging from academic journals analyzing medieval French poetry to the founding documents of a pioneer hospital in North Dakota, right through to Roman Catholic hagiographies.
It's a really eclectic mix of sources.
It really is. Our focus is the life, the legend, and the strangely massive legacy of a 4th century ascetic known as Saint Alexius of Rome. So if you have ever felt the crushing weight of family expectations, or if you've ever wondered how a seemingly simple biography gets twisted and rewritten by different cultures over centuries to, fit their own agendas, this is your ultimate case study.
Yeah, we are looking at an individual who started as a single, anonymous beggar in Syria, whose life story eventually birthed one of the earliest pieces of French literature.
Which is wild.
It is. And it inspired a global network of hospitals, and frankly, reads like a high-stakes ancient drama. To really grasp his legacy, we have to trace how his biography evolved across Syriac, Greek, Latin, and French traditions, and look at the friction between the historical core of his life and the romantic myth that kind of grew around it.
So let's start with who this person actually was before the whole myth-making machine took over. His full name at birth was Alexius, or Alexios in the Greek tradition. But history knows him by a few pretty intense epithets. Early Syriac texts refer to him as Mauritia, and he's broadly known as the Beggar or the Man of God.
And that title, the man of God, it carries a very specific weight in the source material.
Oh, how so?
Well, according to the legend, it wasn't just a generic compliment handed out by his peers. It was given to him when a miraculous icon of the Virgin Mary actually singled him out to the public, identifying him by that exact phrase.
Oh, wow. So like a literal divine pointing finger.
Exactly. It was a divine endorsement that essentially blew his cover when he was, trying to remain completely anonymous.
Today, his modern legacy is deeply fractured, but incredibly vast. Religiously, he is remembered as the patron saint of beggars, pilgrims, and the Alexian brothers, which is a major healing order. But outside of strictly religious circles, his life story acts as this bizarre bridge between early Christian asceticism and the medieval romance novel.
It's a very strange crossover.
Yeah, I want to look at where this all starts, because to understand why he ran away, you really have to look at what he was running away from. The sources place his birth in the 4th century, during the reign of the emperors Honorius and Arcadius. The location is Rome, though. Some early Syriac fragments use a term that could be interpreted as New Rome, pointing toward Constantinople.
Right, but the exact city almost matters less than the socioeconomic reality of his upbringing. Alexius was born into extreme wealth and privilege.
Like top-tier Roman elite.
Oh, absolutely. His father, Euphemianus, was a wealthy Christian Roman senator, and his mother was named Aglae, or Aglaus. The household was incredibly opulent, but it was also famously charitable.
Which is a key detail.
Very key. The Greek texts make a point to highlight that they kept 3 tables set up daily in their home. One for orphans and widows, one for the sick and strangers, and one for beggars.
And that detail brings up a massive irony for me. Usually in these kinds of stories, the rebel runs away from a toxic environment, like they flee an abusive or strict or unloving household. But these parents seem genuinely wonderful.
They do, yeah.
I mean, they are feeding the entire neighborhood out of their own pockets.
Yeah.
Why would a kid who has everything, including genuinely kind, generous parents, want to throw it all away?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at the massive cultural shifts sweeping the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. Christianity had recently become dominant. and a profound counterculture movement was pulling at the minds of young, wealthy Romans in the East.
You're talking about extreme asceticism.
Yes, extreme asceticism. The prevailing philosophy was that true spiritual purity could only be found through absolute grinding poverty and the rejection of all earthly attachments.
I think we tend to hear asceticism and picture, like a modern heir deciding to go backpack off the grid or live in a tiny house for a year. But this was much more severe than that.
Infinitely more severe. Asceticism in the 4th century wasn't a gap year.
Right.
It was the equivalent of a modern billionaire publicly burning their entire stock portfolio, dissolving their multinational corporation, and walking into the desert with nothing but the clothes on their back to sweep the floors of a public clinic.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a violent, total rejection of the entire economic and social system.
And as the only son of a senator, Alexius was the focal point of that entire system. The sources note he was an only child, born after his parents suffered through a long period of infertility, which is a classic folklore motif.
Very common, yes.
So as the sole heir, the worldly ambitions placed on him were immense. He was expected to inherit this vast wealth, carry on the family name, and step into high Roman society. And this societal pressure culminates in an arranged marriage to a woman named Adriatica, or Marina, depending on which translation you read.
Right, and in that era, you weren't just an individual seeking personal happiness. You were the continuation of a bloodline and an estate. Marriage was an economic and political merger that was just essential to the stability of the elite class.
So backing out wasn't really an option.
Not at all. To reject that marriage was to reject the very fabric of society and betray your family's legacy.
Which brings us to the crisis event that shatters his life course. The wedding night.
The breaking point.
Exactly. Instead of consummating the arranged marriage and cementing his expected role, Alexius uses that exact moment of intense expectation to break everything. He convinces his new bride to let him follow his true vocation of poverty and chastity. But he doesn't just, sneak out the back window. The transformation scene is highly dramatic and choreographed.
It's incredibly theatrical.
Yeah, he gives his bride a parting gift, his golden ring and his military belt wrapped in a crimson scarf or ribbon. And he tells her it is a gift from God.
And by framing the gift that way, he is effectively stating that God is now the barrier standing between them. He strips himself of his martial and marital symbols, hands them over, and flees Rome by ship, just completely severing every earthly tie he has.
Now, here is where I really struggle with the morality of this, and I know I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
If you look at the Gesta Romanorum, which was essentially a medieval bestseller, like a collection of moral tales used by preachers across Europe.
Right, hugely influential.
Well, the 19th century translator of that text, C. Swan, absolutely blasts Alexius. Swan argues that Alexius acts like a cruel son and a terrible husband. I mean, he abandons his bride on their wedding night and leaves his parents in sheer agony for decades.
It is harsh by modern standards.
Very harsh. How did medieval audiences justify a supposed saint committing an act that seems so inherently heartless?
Well, that intense human friction is actually the engine of ascetic literature. To the medieval mind, earthly duties, even sacred ones like marriage and honoring your parents, were strictly secondary to a direct calling from the divine.
So God trumps family. Always.
Wow. Exactly. The immense pain he caused his family wasn't ignored. It was viewed as part of his own spiritual martyrdom. It was the agonizing cost of prioritizing heaven over earth. It forces the listener to ask, if God calls you to do something that breaks the hearts of everyone you love, do you still do it?
And he clearly decides yes, which launches him into his first major historical milestone. Alexius arrives in Edessa, Syria. Stripped of his wealth, he lives as a disguised beggar near a church, and he stays there for 17 years.
A massive chunk of time.
Yeah, and the ascetic lifestyle is so brutal, and he is so physically transformed by the poverty that when his father's servants are sent to search for him, they literally pass right by him. They hand him alms, and they don't even recognize their master's son.
And true to the charitable nature he was raised with, he doesn't hoard the alms he's given. He keeps only what he needs to survive the day and gives the rest away to other poor people.
I have a hard time buying this absolute blindness from the servants, though. To me, looking at these sources, it reads less like a literal historical fact and more like a metaphor for class blindness.
Oh, that's a very common read.
Right. Like, they couldn't see their master's son because they were fundamentally incapable of looking a beggar in the eye and seeing a human being, let alone a Roman nobleman.
Yeah.
Is that how contemporary audiences might have interpreted it?
That is exactly the debate among literary historians. It operates on both levels, really. Practically, extreme sun exposure, starvation, and dirt would alter a person's appearance drastically.
Sure.
But symbolically, it represents the invisibility of the poor. He had completely shed his social markers. To the servants, he wasn't a person anymore. He was just a fixture of the street.
But his anonymity in Edessa doesn't last. The legend says a miraculous icon of the Virgin Mary speaks to the local people, identifying him as the man of God. Suddenly, the town reveres him.
And fame is the last thing an ascetic wants.
Exactly. So to flee this unwanted fame, he tries to sail to Tarsus. But the story doesn't let him escape to a new, quiet corner of the map. Instead, we see this incredible anomaly where the elements themselves intervene.
Right, because in ancient literature, the weather is rarely just weather, right? It's a character, often the hand of the divine. A violent, sudden storm forces his ship way off course, blowing him all the way back to Italy. He is forced right back to the one place he tried to escape.
So he returns to his father's estate in Rome. Still completely unrecognized, he asks for shelter as a destitute stranger. And his father, who we know is famous for his charity, permits this beggar to live in a dark cubbyhole under the stairs of his own childhood home.
Where he spends another 17 years.
Which is just, the psychological toll of that is staggering. For 17 years, he lives under his father's stairs. He endures daily abuse, mockery, and physical ill treatment from his own family's servants, people who used to work for him.
Yeah, it's brutal.
He hears his mother weeping for him. He watches his wife mourning him. He bears it all in absolute silence, spending his time secretly teaching catechism to the local children. Why did the authors of this legend structure his life into these two very distinct 17-year chunks? What's the literary mechanism at work there?
Well, the symmetry is highly intentional. The first 17 years in Edessa represent a physical exile. He removes his body from his environment.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the second 17 years represent a much deeper psychological exile. He is physically home, surrounded by everything he gave up, but he remains completely alienated by choice. It proves that his asceticism wasn't just dependent on geography. His detachment from the world was total, even when the world was right in front of him.
It also completely subverts the tropes of ancient storytelling. The academic sources point out a brilliant twist here. In a standard Greek romance novel of the time, you have two lovers kept apart by human villains, pirates, evil kings, jealous rivals.
Typical soap opera stuff.
Exactly. But in the story of Alexius, God is the force keeping him and his bride separated.
Wow.
First by calling him away, then by blowing his ship back, but demanding his continued silence.
And by making God the barrier, the authors elevate the narrative from an earthly romance to a divine one. The dramatic tension isn't about whether they will physically reunite and live happily ever after on earth. It's about whether they will remain spiritually faithful enough to endure the pain so they can reunite in heaven. It recalibrates the audience's understanding of what a happy ending actually looks like.
Which perfectly sets the stage for his final moments, the Transitus. After 17 years under those stairs, around the year 417, Alexius falls ill. Knowing death is near, he asks for papyrus and ink. He writes down the story of his life, his true identity, and his reasons for leaving. And the scene of his death is incredibly theatrical, almost cinematic.
The sources describe a moment where the supernatural just bleeds into the physical world. A heavenly voice rings out across Rome declaring, "Seek the man of God."
Wow.
And simultaneously, the bells of Rome begin to toll completely on their own, drawing massive crowds.
So the crowd, led by the Pope and the Emperor, is guided to the Euphemianus estate, down to the dark cubbyhole under the stairs. But they are too late. They find the beggar already dead, clutching his autobiographical scroll, and then we get this desperate physical struggle.
Yeah, the scroll is locked in his hand.
Right. His father tries to pull the scroll from his dead son's hand, but the grip is ironclad. He cannot pry it loose. Depending on the version you read, only the Pope, or the Emperor, or his faithful wife can finally take the letter from him.
And when the letter is read aloud to the crowd, the devastating plot twist drops. The beggar they have been housing, feeding scraps to, and abusing for 17 years is their own son and husband.
It is the ultimate anagnorisis. That's the Greek literary term for the moment of critical discovery or recognition, where a character's true identity is revealed, usually shifting the entire plot from ignorance to knowledge. His parents and abandoned bride just collapse into tears.
It's completely devastating.
But reading through the sources, the emotional fallout of that enignoresis changes drastically depending on which culture is telling the story, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it really does. If you look at the Latin tradition, the focus is incredibly didactic. It's meant to be a harsh lesson about extreme detachment.
So they don't really comfort the family.
Not at all. The overwhelming grief of the parents is almost framed as a warning against loving earthly things too much. Like they suffered because they were too attached to their son.
That is incredibly bleak.
It is, but when the story moves into France centuries later, the tone softens. The French versions acknowledge human emotion much more gracefully. They often promise a reunion in heaven, suggesting that earthly love isn't entirely bad, it just needs to be subordinated to divine love. It softens the blow for a more courtly, romantic audience.
And that transition to France is where the posthumous legacy of Alexius just explodes. Because for a long time, he was entirely unknown in the West. It wasn't until the late 10th century, specifically in 972, that an exiled Greek metropolitan named Sergius of Damascus brought the legend to Rome.
Right, and Pope Benedict VII gave him an abandoned church on the Aventine Hill.
Yep, and from there, the story went viral across Europe.
The sheer cultural force of the narrative cannot be overstated. By the 11th century, it crosses into France and becomes the Vie de Saint Alexius. But this isn't just a popular poem, it serves as a crucial linguistic mechanism.
A linguistic mechanism.
Yeah, so as spoken Latin was breaking down into regional vernaculars, what would become modern French, Italian, and Spanish, poets needed new structural rhythms to tell complex stories in these new languages.
Oh, I see. So Alexius becomes the test subject for linguistic technology.
Precisely. The Vie de Saint Alexius becomes one of the very first works of French literature written in a 10 or 11-syllable iambic line.
Wow, like a precursor to Shakespeare.
Exactly. This structural innovation is the direct precursor to the iambic pentameter that Shakespeare would use centuries later. The emotional weight of the Alexius story demanded a new kind of poetic dignity, and in providing that, it literally helped shake the French language.
That is mind-blowing. And the legacy doesn't stop at literature either. It anchors itself in real-world institutions. Let's look at the history of St. Alexius Medical Center in Bismarck, North Dakota. In 1885, the Benedictine sisters arrived in this rough pioneer town. They converted the old Lambourne Hotel into a hospital for $30,000.
That was a lot of money back then.
A huge amount. And they charged patients $1 a day and gave riverboatmen a discount and 90 cents. They even treated Teddy Roosevelt there. But why name a modern frontier hospital after a 4th century ascetic who lived under some stairs?
Because of what he represents. The man under the stairs is the ultimate symbol of the unrecognized sick and the marginalized poor. By naming the hospital after him, the sisters were making a theological statement.
Which was?
That when you care for the most destitute, broken person who walks through those doors, you might secretly be caring for a saint. The myth provides the operational blueprint for radical frontier charity.
I love that. But the tension between that myth and objective history eventually catches up with him. In 1969, the Catholic Church underwent a massive calendar revision, and they actually removed St. Alexius' feast day from the general Roman calendar.
Yeah, he got officially downgraded.
The reasoning was that his biography was deemed entirely too legendary.
The Catholic Church wanted to clean up its historical records. Historians like Johann Peter Kirsch analyzed the texts and concluded that the only verifiable historical basis is that a pious ascetic in Edessa lived as a beggar and was venerated.
So just the core kernel of the story.
Right. The rest of it, the wealthy Roman senator father, the dramatic wedding night escape, the 17 years under the stairs, the magic scroll, was likely mythical layering added by later generations to make the story more impactful.
But even with his feast day removed, the physical footprint of that mythical layering is still incredibly prevalent today. His relics are highly venerated and scattered across the world. In 1398, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, Palaiologos, donated what is claimed to be his skull to the Agia Lavra monastery in Greece, where it remains today.
And there's more in Rome, too.
Exactly. If you travel to his basilica on the Aventine Hill in Rome today, you can still see an elaborate glass case above the altar, allegedly containing the actual wooden staircase he lived under. Which brings me to a fascinating contradiction.
Oh, what's that?
Does it actually matter that the historical record was deemed too legendary in 1969? Like, does objective accuracy matter when a supposedly fake story has inspired so much tangible, real-world good?
Well, it forces us to examine the fundamental utility of myth. Legends do not exist to provide us with a sterile list of historical facts. They exist to encode and transmit the deepest values of a society.
Right.
The story of Saint Alexius provided a durable, endlessly adaptable template for humility. It reinforced the idea that the lowest among us might possess the highest spiritual worth.
Even if he wasn't really a Roman nobleman.
Exactly. Whether the man under the stairs was truly a Roman nobleman or just an anonymous Syrian beggar, the ideal of that man drove centuries of real-world care for the sick, inspired foundational literature, and gave countless people a framework for understanding sacrifice.
It is incredible to trace that trajectory. We start with an anonymous beggar in the Syrian desert, and through centuries of storytelling, translation, and intense cultural projection, he becomes a Roman nobleman, the anchor of an early French Romance poem, a patron saint of pilgrims, and the namesake for frontier hospitals treating presidents in North Dakota.
He becomes whatever the era requires him to be.
Yes, which perfectly illustrates the elasticity of a powerful narrative. A story survives because it can stretch to fit the psychological needs of whoever is telling it, whether a culture needs a strict, unyielding ascetic role model to critique their own wealth, or a tragic romantic hero to explore the boundaries of earthly love.
It really is a masterpiece of cultural adaptation.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over. The legend of Saint Alexius shows us that sometimes a society needs a specific kind of hero so badly that they will collectively write, rewrite, and layer a person's life until it fits their cultural moment perfectly. The man himself disappears under the weight of the story we build around him.
That's very true.
So it forces us to look at our own era and ask, when we look at the historical figures, the pioneers, or the leaders we idolize today, how much of their story is the objective, unvarnished truth, and how much is just the story we desperately need them to be?
It is a critical lens to apply to any history. Sometimes the most successful vanishing act isn't about leaving the world. It is about staying perfectly still while the world paints an entirely new identity over you.
A brilliant way to frame it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life, the legend, and the enduring mysteries of Saint Alexius. Keep questioning the stories you hear, keep looking for the mechanisms beneath the myth, and we will see you next time.